Usually she embraces and touches him, but today he wants him to lie naked in bed. He held his breath and begged, "Grandma, please, I don't want to, I don't like it." His grandmother responded, "Get on the bed now and take off your pants or else I will deal with you." Ethan jumped on the bed and began crying, but his grandmother didn't care. When she finished abusing him, she threatened that if you tell anyone, they will never believe you, so keep quiet, and she departed. In the bustling city of Heavenwood, the Bakers were a prominent family, known for their towering empire of businesses and lavish lifestyle. Mr. and Mrs. Baker were seen as the perfect power couple, always in the headlines for their success and social contributions. Yet behind the glitz and glamour was their only son, Ethan, an 8-year-old boy whose life was anything but perfect. Ethan lived in a sprawling mansion with glittering chandeliers, grand staircases, and endless rooms filled with treasures. But for all its luxury, the house felt cold. His parents were rarely around, always caught up in their whirlwind of meetings and business deals. "We are doing this for you, Ethan," Mrs. Baker often told him, brushing his hair as she rushed out the door. "One day, you'll understand." But Ethan didn't understand. All he knew was that he was lonely. He had everything money could buy but lacked the one thing he craved most, time with his parents. Whenever the Bakers had an extended trip or an especially hectic schedule, Ethan was sent to stay with his grandmother, Mrs. Lorraine. Her house was on the outskirts of Heavenwood, a picturesque cottage surrounded by woods. Though it looked cozy from the outside, Ethan hated going there. Mrs. Lorraine, with her carefully styled silver hair and warm smile, was adored by everyone. But Ethan saw a side of her no one else did, a side that made his stomach churn every time he was sent to her house. "Do I have to go?" Ethan pleaded as the family's driver loaded his overnight bag into the car. "Yes, darling," Mr. Baker said with a dismissive wave. "Your grandmother loves having you. Be good for her." Ethan swallowed his protest. As the car pulled away from the mansion, he stared out the window, his heart heavy with dread. Mrs. Lorraine greeted Ethan with open arms when he arrived, her house filled with the smell of freshly baked cookies. "Ethan, my dear. Come give your grandma a big hug," she exclaimed, pulling him into her arms. She spoiled him during the day, preparing his favorite meals and letting him play video games. For a brief moment, Ethan allowed himself to hope that maybe this time would be different. That evening, as Ethan lay in the small bed tucked into the corner of her guest room, she entered without knocking. "Ethan," she said, sitting on the edge of his bed. Her voice was soft but carried an unsettling edge. "Come closer to Grandma. Come give me some sugar." Ethan hesitated, his instinct screaming at him to stay still. But she reached out, pulling him into her lap. Her hands moved in ways that made him feel sick. She would held him too close, gave him a kiss on the lips, and caressed his back, and even did more crazy things that made him want to cry. "Remember, this is our little secret," she whispered, her voice sugary sweet yet menacing. "If you tell anyone, they won't believe you. They'll think you're lying." Tears welled in Ethan's eyes, but he bit his lip to stop them from spilling. He didn't understand why this was happening or what he had done to deserve it. All he knew was that he wanted it to stop. The next morning, he tried to tell his parents when they called to check in. "I don't want to stay here anymore," he said, his voice shaking. "Nonsense," Mrs. Baker replied lightly. "Your grandmother adores you. Be good, Ethan. We'll be back soon." Ethan's heart sank. His parents weren't listening. They never did. Back at school, Ethan's behavior began to change. Once a cheerful and lively boy, he now sat alone during recess, avoiding his friends. He spoke less, and his laughter, once infectious, had vanished entirely. Miss Collins, his teacher, noticed the shift. "Ethan," she said one afternoon, kneeling beside his desk after class. Is everything alright? You've been so quiet lately. Ethan shrugged, avoiding her gaze. I'm fine, he mumbled, his voice barely audible. Miss Collins wasn't convinced. She saw the sadness in his eyes, the way his shoulders drooped as if carrying an invisible weight. But Ethan wouldn't say more, so she let it go, hoping he might open up later. At home, his parents remained oblivious. They were too preoccupied with their schedules to notice the changes in their son. When Ethan tried to tell them he didn't want to go back to Mrs. Lorraine's house, they brushed him off. Don't be silly, Mr. Baker said. You're lucky to have such a loving grandmother. Ethan stopped trying to explain. His parents didn't believe him, and Mrs. Lorraine's threats rang in his ears. No one will believe you, she had said. It's our secret. The secret grew heavier with each passing day. Ethan's nights at his grandmother's house were filled with dread, and even his days at school felt like a prison. The more he tried to suppress his feelings, the more they consumed him. One evening, while Ethan was getting ready for bed at his grandmother's house, she entered his room with that same fake smile. Ethan's heart began to speed. He knew what was coming and despised it. His body was heavy with anxiety, but he didn't know how to stop her. He felt powerless, as if no one in the world could help him be a nice boy. Ethan's grandmother murmured as she perched on the side of his bed. Remember, this is our secret. Now lie down on the bed and take off your pants. Ethan's heart raced as he realized his grandmother was going above and beyond this time. Usually she embraces and touches him, but today he wants him to lie naked in bed. He held his breath and begged, Grandma, please, I don't want to, I don't like it. His grandmother responded, Get on the bed now and take off your pants or else I will deal with you. Ethan, crying, jumped on the bed and began crying, but his grandmother didn't care. When she finished abusing him, she threatened that if you tell anyone, they will never believe you, so keep quiet, and she departed. Ethan felt stuck. He wished he could escape, run away, or simply wake up from this nightmare. Instead, he closed his eyes, praying that all would end soon. One day, Ethan's class was visited by a guest speaker. A woman named Mrs. Potter stood at the front of the room, her colorful scarf and kind smile catching everyone's attention. Good morning, children, she began warmly. Today, we are going to talk about something very important, your safety. Ethan barely looked up at first, too lost in his own thoughts. But as Mrs. Potter continued, her words began to pierce through his fog of despair. Sometimes, she said, people we know might do things that make us feel uncomfortable or scared. It's important to remember that your body is yours, and no one has the right to touch you in a way that makes you feel bad. Ethan's heart pounded. She was describing exactly what he felt but had never been able to put into words. If someone ever does something that makes you feel unsafe, Mrs. Potter continued, you need to tell a trusted adult. It could be a teacher, a parent, or even someone here at school. And most importantly, you don't have to keep it a secret. The word secret made Ethan freeze. His grandmother's warning echoed in his mind, if you tell anyone, no one will believe you. But Mrs. Potter's voice was so reassuring, so kind, that he felt a flicker of hope. At the end of her talk, Mrs. Potter stayed behind to answer questions. Ethan hesitated, his hands trembling. As the other students filed out for recess, he remained in his seat. Miss Collins noticed him lingering. Ethan, she said gently, sitting beside him. Do you want to talk? Ethan hesitated, his throat dry. But Mrs. Potter's words rang in his ears, you don't have to keep it a secret. Finally, he whispered, I need help. Ethan sat in the quiet classroom, trembling as he looked at Miss Collins. She crouched beside him, her face full of concern, while Mrs. Potter waited nearby, her kind eyes fixed on the boy who was clearly struggling. What's wrong, Ethan? Miss Collins asked softly, her voice as gentle as the autumn breeze drifting through the open window. Ethan hesitated, glancing at the door as if fearing someone might burst in and stop him. He fiddled with the hem of his shirt, his fingers shaking. "You can tell us anything," Mrs. Potter said, taking a step closer. "We're here to help, and we'll believe you." The words opened a floodgate inside Ethan. Tears spilled from his eyes as he began to speak, his voice shaky and uneven. "It's my grandmother," he whispered. She does things to me that make me feel scared. She tells me it's a secret and that no one will believe me." Miss Collins' breath hitched, but she kept her expression calm, her hand steady as she reached out to touch his shoulder. "You're so brave for telling us, Ethan," she said gently. "I promise we are going to help you." Ethan sobbed, relief and fear mingling together as he let it all out. He described the nights at Mrs. Lorraine's house, the way her demeanor changed when they were alone, and the terrifying words she whispered to keep him silent. Mrs. Potter nodded, her face grave but composed. "You did the right thing, Ethan. Now we can make sure this stops." That afternoon, Miss Collins and Mrs. Potter contacted Child Protective Services, CPS. They explained the situation, recounting Ethan's confession in detail. A caseworker named Mr. Hargrove arrived at the school shortly after, his tall frame and kind demeanor putting Ethan at ease. "Hi, Ethan," Mr. Hargrove said, kneeling to meet the boy's eyes. "I'm here to listen, okay? You're not in trouble, and this isn't your fault. I just want to understand what's been happening so I can help you." Ethan hesitated, but Miss Collins stayed by his side, holding his hand as he spoke to Mr. Hargrove. He repeated everything he had told his teacher, his voice steadier this time but still filled with emotion. Mr. Hargrove listened carefully, nodding occasionally. When Ethan finished, he said, "Thank you for telling me, Ethan. You're very brave. I promise we are going to do everything we can to make sure you're safe." The wheels of action began to turn quickly. That evening, Mr. Hargrove visited the Baker's mansion to inform Ethan's parents of what had been happening. Mr. and Mrs. Baker, exhausted from their workday, were blindsided. "What do you mean?" Mrs. Baker asked, her face pale as she clutched the edge of the kitchen counter. "My mother. She would never, this has to be some mistake." "It's no mistake," Mr. Hargrove said gently but firmly. "Ethan has been very clear about what's been happening. We've also found concerning signs of abuse." Mr. Baker stood in stunned silence, his face reddening with guilt as he remembered all the times Ethan had tried to tell them he didn't want to go to his grandmother's house. How did we miss this?" he muttered, his voice breaking. "We failed him." The next morning, CPS took immediate steps to ensure Ethan's safety. He was moved temporarily to a nearby children's center while the investigation into Mrs. Lorraine began. When the police arrived at Mrs. Lorraine's house, she greeted them with her usual charm, a tray of freshly baked cookies in hand. "Officers, what a surprise," she said, her smile wide and disarming. "What can I do for you?" Her demeanor changed when they informed her of the allegations. Her face stiffened, and she crossed her arms defensively. "That's absurd," she said sharply. "My grandson loves staying here. He must be confused." But as investigators began to dig deeper, they found troubling patterns in Mrs. Lorraine's behavior. The evidence against her grew, and soon, she was arrested. The news sent shockwaves through Heavenwood. The elegant Mrs. Lorraine, beloved by many in the community, was now exposed as a predator. Neighbors whispered in disbelief, their perceptions of her shattered. Meanwhile, Ethan stayed at the children's center, surrounded by caring staff and counselors who worked to make him feel safe. Though he missed his parents, he began to feel the weight of his secret lift, replaced by a faint sense of hope. Back at the Baker mansion, the atmosphere was heavy with guilt and regret. Mr. and Mrs. Baker struggled to come to terms with what their son had endured, and their role in allowing it to happen. "I should have listened to him," Mrs. Baker sobbed one evening, sitting at the kitchen table with her head in her hands. "All those times he said he didn't want to go. I thought he was just being difficult." Mr. Baker paced the room, his fist clenched. "We were so focused on work, on building this empire, that we neglected our own son. How could we let this happen?" CPS scheduled meetings with the Bakers to assess whether they could provide a safe and supportive environment for Ethan moving forward. The caseworker, Mr. Hargrove, was firm but empathetic. "It's clear that you love your son," he said during one meeting. "But love isn't enough if you're not present for him. You need to rebuild trust and show that you're willing to prioritize his well-being." Ethan, meanwhile, began attending therapy sessions to help him process the trauma he had endured. His therapist, Dr. Simmons, was a gentle woman with a calm voice and a warm smile. She encouraged Ethan to express his feelings, validating his pain while helping him understand that what happened was not his fault. "You're very brave, Ethan," she told him during one session. "It takes a lot of courage to speak up, especially when it's someone you care about who's hurt you. But now you've taken the first step toward healing." Ethan nodded slowly, a flicker of determination in his eyes. The days after Mrs. Lorraine's arrest were tumultuous. Ethan was now living with a foster family, the Thompsons, who had opened their home to him while CPS continued its investigation. The Thompsons were warm and kind, with a small house full of laughter and love, the kind of environment Ethan had never experienced. For the first time, Ethan felt safe. His foster parents, Mr. and Mrs. Thompson, treated him gently, asking about his feelings and encouraging him to speak when he was ready. Their two children, Lucy and Ben, made an effort to include him in their games, drawing him out of his shell. Back at the Baker mansion, guilt consumed Mr. and Mrs. Baker. They were allowed supervised visits with Ethan, but each meeting was fraught with tension. "Ethan," Mrs. Baker said during one visit, her voice trembling. "I'm so sorry. We should have listened to you. Can you ever forgive us?" Ethan stared at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "I don't know," he said quietly. "You didn't believe me when I needed you." His words cut deep, leaving his parents grappling with the consequences of their neglect. Mrs. Lorraine's trial began in earnest, with the courtroom packed as the community came to terms with the truth about the woman they had once admired. Ethan was called to testify, a terrifying prospect for an 8-year-old boy. "You don't have to do this if you're not ready," Dr. Simmons told him during one of their therapy sessions. "I want to," Ethan said firmly. "I want everyone to know what she did." On the day of his testimony, Ethan stood before the court, his small figure dwarfed by the imposing room. His voice wavered as he recounted the nights at Mrs. Lorraine's house, but he didn't falter. He spoke the truth, his courage shining through. The courtroom was silent as he finished, the weight of his words settling over everyone present. Mrs. Lorraine, sitting stiffly at the defendant's table, refused to meet his gaze. After weeks of testimony and deliberation, the verdict was announced. Mrs. Lorraine was found guilty on all charges. The judge, her voice firm, delivered a harsh sentence. "Your actions have caused immeasurable harm to innocent children," she said. "You will spend the rest of your life in prison, where you can no longer hurt anyone." As the gavel struck, Ethan felt a wave of relief wash over him. The monster who had haunted his nights was finally gone. With the trial over, Ethan began focusing on healing. His therapy sessions with Dr. Simmons became a cornerstone of his recovery. She helped him navigate his emotions, teaching him that it was okay to feel anger, sadness, and even confusion. "You've been through something no child should ever experience," Dr. Simmons told him. "But you're not defined by what happened to you. You're strong, Ethan, and you can build a brighter future." Ethan took those words to heart. At the same time, the Bakers were undergoing their own journey of redemption. During one supervised visit, Mr. Baker knelt in front of Ethan, his voice heavy with emotion. "I know we let you down," he said. "But I promise, from now on, we'll always listen to you. We'll never put work before you again." Ethan didn't respond immediately. Trust wasn't something he could rebuild overnight. But as the weeks passed, he saw genuine change in his parents. They showed up for every visit, asked about his feelings, and made an effort to connect. After months of assessment and therapy, CPS determined that the Bakers had made significant progress. Ethan was given the choice to return home, and while he was hesitant, he agreed, on the condition that his parents continued to prioritize him. His return to the Baker mansion was bittersweet. The house, once a symbol of his loneliness, now felt warmer. His parents had transformed one of the rooms into a cozy playroom for him, filled with books, toys, and a beanbag chair where they could read together. "We want this to be a fresh start," Mrs. Baker said, her voice hopeful. Ethan nodded. He wasn't ready to forgive completely, but he was willing to try. Life slowly fell into a new rhythm. The Bakers adjusted their work schedules, ensuring they spent more time at home. They enrolled Ethan in activities he enjoyed, cheering him on at soccer games and helping him with school projects. For the first time, Ethan felt like he was part of a real family. Ethan's story is a reminder of the importance of listening to children and prioritizing their emotional well-being. Parents must recognize that providing material comforts is no substitute for being present and attentive. It also underscores the power of speaking up and seeking help, showing that courage and kindness can overcome even the darkest moments. Every child deserves to feel safe, loved, and heard. Hello viewers, that was what we had for you for today. If you loved the story, kindly give it a like, and don't forget to drop your thoughts in the comments. You can also hit the subscribe button if you haven't subscribed already. Thanks for watching and see you in our next video.